Today's presenter is Carter Phipps. Carter probably doesn't need much of an introduction, but for anyone who doesn't know, Carter is the co-founder of the Institute for Cultural Evolution, the author of Evolutionaries, the co-author of Conscious Leadership. He produces the podcast Thinking Ahead, and he was the former executive editor of What is Enlightenment Magazine. Carter, always a pleasure. The floor is yours.
All right. Thanks so much, Rigel. Let me just share my screen here. Can everyone see that?
Yep.
Okay, great. So today I wanted to talk about my ideas about cultural evolution. And this is a unique group to talk to because there's a kind of shared language to a large degree. I understand some people might be new to the group, but there's a shared language around a lot of ideas, developmental ideas and cultural evolution ideas, that allows you to speak into this group in a way that's very hard to speak to any other group. So when I speak to this group, I like to take advantage of that and talk about really kind of an inside baseball discussion of cultural evolution, developmental ideas, worldviews, all of it. So integral philosophy. So yeah, that's how I'm going to approach this. And there's about 4 key ideas in this presentation that I want to get across. A couple are mine, a couple are other people's. Some I'm not even sure where they came from, but they're good. And it's a little more speculative. I want to give you some window into my latest thinking and the kinds of things. If Steve and I were having a beer together, I might just talk about and say, what about this? What about that? So that's the kind of presentation I want to do. So I've called it Learning to Love the Plateau. I will talk about that idea. I won't get into that right now, where that comes from and why I titled it that. But before we get into that, let's just talk about how did we get here to our cultural moment. Well, the post-war era was historically unique. The height of modernism as a sole driver of our economic sphere. And this interesting thing happened in the post-war era, partially because it was a post-war era, and those have a certain tenor and quality. But whereas in the 19th century and the early 20th century, as modernism emerged in the 19th century, it was in a dialectic with traditionalism, and it was often in a kind of intense dialectic, a lot of tension and a lot of war between modernism and traditionalism. In the post-war era, for whatever reason, and we could talk about why, there emerged a sort of truce between them. Now, it didn't mean that there wasn't tension, but it wasn't an all-out war. And I think the truce is an interesting thing. What am I doing here? Why am I not? Oh, there we go. So what do I mean by truce? Well, there's a dynamic tension, but not an all-out war between them. And there's something about the truce that I think we see sometimes in cultural evolution can be the kind of soil of synthesis. It can provide a synthetic environment for something new to emerge. And the post-war era was like that. There was tension, there was disagreement, but it wasn't an all-out war in the sense that everything that's associated with modernism is bad if you're a traditionalist, or everything that's associated with traditionalism is bad if you're a modernist, right? And somehow in that, not a war, but a dynamic truce, it provided a soil of synthesis, and boom, it allowed progressive postmodernism in the late 60s to burst out of that soil and emerge. And so this idea of a truce comes from, at least the way when I initially started using that term, I got it from Robert Keegan, who uses it in relationship to individual development. He talks about evolutionary truces, the stages in individual development. This is different. This is culture. This is not individual development. This is about culture, but kind of a similar idea. So we'll see as we talk about cultural evolution in this state, as we go forward through the decades, that idea of a truce might be an important something to recognize as we think about the dynamics of cultural evolution. that soil of synthesis. All right. So, postmodernism bursts out of modernism and traditionalism, right? In the late 60s, it comes running out through a lot of different forms, but fundamentally, there were three avenues through which it emerged. And one was the social justice movement, and you have civil rights and women's rights and gay rights and all of that emerged through that era. You have environmentalism, the ecological movement, this recognition that modernism is endangering our environment, endangering our ecology. This appreciation of what that means, this new appreciation. We have Earth Day and all of that. So it emerges in that form. And then the form that is dear to my heart and has been such a critical part of my journey and so many people's journeys in this culture, maybe on this call, was the consciousness movement. And again, it took a multitude of forms, but the spiritual but not religious movement, the New Age movement, the East meets West movement, all of it, the American Buddhist movement, right? It took a lot of forms, but again, it was absolutely a critical part of the threesome there. So when a few years ago, I happened to tell this to Jeff Salzman, I think he's on the call. I said, Jeff, postmodernism is really three parts of it. Come on, there's three. And I was trying to explain it to him. And he listened to me and he said, that's I, we, and it. So I thought that's very good. So I is consciousness, we is social justice, environmentalism is it. So in a certain, that worldview emerged through those three dimensions of reality. So, yeah. So that just kind of paints the picture of that era and the three faces of modernism. Now, the impact of the postmodern emergence, it did a lot to culture, right? It not only did it itself have a tremendous value as it emerged, it released some of that red warrior energy, because one of the things that had happened in culture up to that point in that post-war era is there was a lot of collective energy, but there was a lot of collective stasis too. And so when you have postmodernism emerge, it bursts through with all of the energy. It releases a lot of, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, right? That's the key. And that red warrior energy. And sometimes you need that energy for cultural evolution to occur. Now that's a double-sided sword, because we're seeing now that you release a lot of red energy into the culture and a lot of shit goes down. It's not all good. There's a lot of negative stuff that happens, but it also provides the energy that you need for new things to happen. And so that's a very important distinction. And sometimes with cultural evolution, I was thinking about this today as I was preparing this, the way cultural evolution has worked up to now, so often it's with a hammer. You swing to one side and then you release all this energy, and then you have a war, and then you swing to the other side, and somewhere in that you kind of find your way forward. But as we go forward, one of the great challenges of our era, and one of the great challenges of anything that we would call integral philosophy or developmental philosophy, is to start to reduce that hammer to a scalpel, right? So, because as we go forward with the emergence of the technology we have, a hammer becomes a very dangerous way to evolve, and we need a scalpel as we evolve. So, anyway, that's a little bit of an aside, but it's an important point. We need to be able to not swing all the way to this side or swing all the way to that side. All right. So the other big part of the impact of the postmodern emergence is it changes and softens modernism. So we're 50 years on from that, more than 50 years. And the modernism we see today is changed radically because it's been influenced by postmodern progressive culture that emerged after it. And the culture war begins. The culture war we know and love. All right. So now I want to present really the essential idea of this maybe presentation that I've been thinking about. And And I've never heard it presented quite like this, so maybe I missed someone who's talked about it. But I've become convinced that, the question of how culture evolves is such a critical question. I've been asking myself that question for 20 years or 30 years even, but definitely for about 25 years. And it's a question that you kind of meditate on and think about a lot. And one of the ways in which I think culture evolves is through not through, you have these big worldviews that are containers for a lot, modernism, traditionalism, postmodern progressivism, green, orange, blue, and spiral dynamics, right? You have these big cultural ecosystems, let's say. But how does culture evolve, right? Well, one of the ways I think it evolves is through these smaller cultural movements, small to mid-sized cultural movements. And these are like tribes that are holding a certain idea, right? And they're pushing it into culture. And so they're seeding culture. So I'm calling those seed cultures, right? Of course, tribes that they can be political, they can be cultural, they can be spiritual, philosophical, economic. They can be all of the above, right? But they're often associated with one worldview. They don't have to be. They can be a mix. They're like controlled cultural explosions that create evolution, right? So if you have a car, if you have a big explosion, the car blows up. But the way an engine works in a car is you have a bunch of controlled explosions, right? And that's what causes the car to move forward. So these seed cultures push a certain set of ideas into culture and can be very influential. Now, they're not always influential, but they can be. And they're like a little controlled explosion. You have another one, and that's kind of how culture, those worldviews move forward and culture itself moves forward. And I think that these are my speculations about seed cultures. Maybe someone will do some work on this at some point. But I think I have some thoughts about the characteristics of seed cultures. Often there's a form of senius that are at the heart of these movements. So this is another idea that people might not have heard. And the idea of senius is the idea that often when you find a great genius, or even just a simple genius, not a great genius, just a genius, you often find a group of people around that person. And what you find is, though a genius may emerge from a little collective, that the ideas that inspired that person emerged out of a small group of people who are working off of each other. They're mixed. They have this person doing this and that person doing this and that person doing that. And then they all were in tension and dialogue with each other, and they all were pushing something forward, and they are on to a certain set of ideas or a certain set of music styles or whatever it is. But it's a form of genius in which they were all working together. So the idea is the genius is in the scene, right? The genius is in the scene, not in the person. It's in the person too, but it's in the scene, right? So people have called it genius. But I was thinking, yes, that's true. But often when you get a genius, there's other people involved in that group. There are people who are featuring those ideas. There's forums for sharing those ideas. There's community organizers who are excited about those ideas. You get more than a genius. What you usually get is a little culture around that tribe. And there's a few people who could be more, could be different sizes. But you get a kind of a genius in the middle of a larger seed culture, and it's pushing a certain set of ideas into culture, or it's pushing a certain set of musical styles in the culture, or it's pushing a certain set of art in the culture. It can look in a lot of different ways. But it's interesting to me to think about cultural evolution in this form. So it represents a certain type of concentrated cultural power and energy, these seed cultures. And they attract a lot of cultural capital and talent. And if you've been part of a dynamic seed culture, you know it. It's exciting to be part of one. Now, my suggestion is that they vary in size. they have to be bigger than one tribe. You know, you can't just have one charismatic leader. That doesn't work because there's not enough. There's not the dynamism you need in that. You need people working off each other and working with each other, and you need a lot of roles to be played to create a kind of culture, right? It can't just be one charismatic leader, but it can't be so big as to be diffuse, right? If it's too big and there's too many ideas, it just kind of is diffuse, right? It needs to have some concentration. It needs to have some, some sense that the culture knows what that seed culture is doing. It has to have a few important things it's trying to accomplish. It needs to be small enough, in other words, to be kind of internally coherent and powerful in that coherence. And seed cultures can be enormously influential. And some can not last that long and not be so influential. So of course they can vary. And I say they can be involved in truth, beauty, and goodness. It can be philosophy, it can be religion. You have a seed culture. It can be in any area where you can have one of these cultures, but it kind of acts to empower culture and kind of move culture forward, and also move and change and respond to a larger cultural worldview as well. So, like examples of seed cultures, I don't know if all these are exactly right, but these are kind of just some I thought about. You know, you get the founding fathers, right? That was an example of a kind of a seed culture. They were pushing something, right? They were trying to do something together. The Renaissance, of course, people always talk about the Renaissance, right? Early modernism. But I think it's early modernism, but it's an early seed culture that was using some new modern ideas, right? The Reformation, same thing. The beat poets, a seed culture of poetry, but also just a lifestyle, right? And trying to embrace this new early postmodern lifestyle, Austrian School of Economics, a seed culture of modernism, right? Trying to reform modernism and what economics meant in modernism and capitalism. Theosophy and spiritualism was a whole kind of, you'd have to dive into that a little more to know what was the seed culture in there, but there's a whole set of ideas and approaches to spirituality between Blavatsky and Steiner, all that kind of came out of that movement that were enormously influential through the 20th century, right? The early environmental movement, I don't know as much about that one. I bet Steve could tell us about that, exactly how that one, the impact of that one. The women's rights movement, you had a couple different generations of that, but again, it acted like that. You have a few, you have a number of sort of luminaries that then and then you have a whole cultural structures that attach themselves to those luminaries, and then it pushes ideas into the culture. Frankfurt School, that's a more of an academic, Marxist, and Habermas came out of that. That's a whole world. Again, I'm not even saying I agree with all the ideas of these seed cultures. I'm just trying to talk about the dynamic, the quality of them, to think about them. American Buddhism was probably a real seed culture. Early jazz, another one. So there you go. That's a new idea you're the first to ever heard it. Seed cultures and their effect. All right. So with that as a kind of momentary stepping back and looking at the larger picture of evolution, let's get back into our timeline, right? So postmodernism expands in the 80s and 90s, right? We get in each of those ways, right? And there's some backlash, but not an all-out war. There's some political backlash in the 70s with Nixon, then you get the Reagan Democrats. So there's some backlash and there's tension there, but there's not modernism is still ascendant. Modernism doesn't feel totally victimized yet by progressive postmodernism. It doesn't feel totally under attack. It has to reassert its dominance, and it does in certain ways, but it's also being influenced throughout this era. It's being influenced by postmodern ideas, by progressive ideas. There's environmental movements that are influencing it. There's new forms of, oh, I misspelled that, new forms of capitalism. Conscious capitalism hasn't emerged yet, but there's new forms of conscious styles of capitalism that are emerging in this era. And you generally get this a little more diverse, a little more globally oriented, a positive sense of social justice expansion. I don't mean wokeness, that comes later. You get greater immigration. You get a lot of elements where progressive postmodernism is doing one of its jobs, which is it's making the whole culture kindler and gentler in all kinds of ways, right? And all of those are good, but a lot of them are. And then as we get into the 90s, the consciousness movement, you get the new age in the 80s and the consciousness movement's expanding in the 90s. It's super in ascendance. It's super popular. It's having a huge impact. The newspapers are writing stories about the spiritual but not religious movement. The boomer generation is in their 40s and 50s, I think, as we go through this era into the 90s and 50s and the 2000s. And they're having their moment as the dominant culture in around, and then you get the consciousness movement, as I said, which is of the three prongs of progressive postmodernism. It's the least anti-modern. It's the least in all-out war, or not. None of them are in all-out war, but it's the least in tension. It still has a lot of anti-modern elements. Don't get me wrong, but it's the least anti-modern. The environmental movement, the social justice movement are much more so. And I think that's interesting because what we get then, and arising directly out of that consciousness movement, right, in the late 90s and really early 2000s is boom. We get one of the earliest seed cultures of integral, right? Or developmental, or whatever we want to call it, right? So we get this in 99, we get this new culture of what we might call integral. We can call it different things. It was initially birthed in the cradle of postmodernism and progressive spirituality, which again, I just think we should remember that. Sometimes they even get conflated, right? One of the, Wilbur at that time is at the height of his influence. He starts gathering leaders to his place. He gets Silicon Valley money, and that's important too, because you have modernism is providing that wealth, providing that funding. The success of modernism is part of what's driving that emergence, right? So you have it's coming out of the consciousness movement. You have the success of modernism. So you get that Silicon Valley money, forms the Integral Institute, becomes a kind of center of that seed culture. But what is Enlightenment? Andrew Cohen's community, spiritual community that I was part of for many, many years. And I got to be part of that magazine. That magazine became a forum for that seed culture, right? For that larger community. We were featuring people and seeding integral, spiritual, and developmental evolutionary ideas into the space. And people were reading that, and then people were getting attracted to it. And it created this kind of gravity, right? And it was a crossover. There was a lot of progressive spirituality in it, but also a lot of these other ideas. And lots of other leaders, and even in the progressive spirituality space, got attracted to this. It attracted a huge number of BYPs. I don't know why I to that, bright young people, who now are doing all kinds of things. And it lasted almost a decade. So it wasn't large. It was never that big. But because it had some cultural concentration and power, a lot of people were influenced by it. When a seed culture is really powerful, it punches way above its weight in culture, right? When it holds on to some piece of truth, in this case, or beauty, or goodness, it can punch way above its weight, and that's how this one was. Even today, like, I'm always amazed by, in all parts of culture, like, I'll be talking to someone who knows what they're doing, but someone who's having some cultural power and influence, and I find out, or is interesting, their thinking's really interesting, and I find out that they were influenced in some form by this seed culture, by my work or Steve's work, or what is Enlightenment, or Wilbur, or something else. in some surprising way. And this seed culture, then it birthed a lot of spores that are out there right now. The seed culture itself ended, right? But it birthed a lot of spores. Or I don't know. I'm mixing my metaphors, seeds and spores, and But but it birthed. But there's a lot of spores out there that are having a big influence. And eventually, we're going to see the emergence of a new seed culture that's going to be powerful in some form or other. We will see. So the 2010s bring a new cultural tone, right? A number of things into that seed culture. Just, you know, but one of them was just the financial crisis. It changes the calculus for a lot of things. And you need the success of modernism to get these higher forms of emergence. They're all based on the success of modernism. Modernism got attacked on two fronts. This also started to ratchet up the tenor of the culture war. Modern 9/11 was an attack from traditionalism, and that became a global preoccupation and created a whole new movement in the West around defending modernism from traditionalism, right? And then as the 2010s goes on, more and more the social justice part of the progressive postmodern movement starts to, and especially with young people coming out of colleges at the time, young social justice warriors start to attack modernism from the other side. And modernism is under attack from two fronts, and you get this strong sort of reactionary movement in modernism. Is this dawning realization that modernism or modern liberalism is in danger from above and below, in a way. But the below part we were used to. Modernism had been in danger from traditionalism for years, so it was a little bit used to that. But it wasn't used to being in danger from above. I'm using above and below, but it wasn't used to being in danger from progressive postmodernism. It wasn't really aware of that danger to the degree that it became aware of in the 2010s. And so what you get then is a new seed culture that emerges around the middle of the last decade. It starts with Jordan Peterson, and then I kind of watched this happen a little bit with with about 10 intellectuals that all kind of form around one common idea, and there's a number of podcasts that starts to feature their work, and each of them blow up in a big way, and they're relating to each other as this kind of little group of intellectuals. It didn't last long, and now it's kind of blown up, but it was very influential for when it was there. It was the intellectual, what they call the intellectual dark web, and they didn't agree on a lot. They came from totally different areas, those intellectuals, but they all agreed on one thing: modernism must be defended, right? From this movement in progressive postmodernism that is trying to, in their minds, wipe out modernism. So for the first time, you get this very strong reactionary movement in modernism to defend itself, now not just from traditionalism. When I was growing up, it was defending from traditionalism. Now it's defending from social justice warriors who want to undermine in their ideas the very foundations of liberalism, right? So modernism gets into this defensive, reactionary tone to a lot of the culture. It gets into this very defensive, reactionary position, and that's where it stays to this day in many ways. And the MAGA movement is a mix of things, but it arose on the backs of that, right? The other thing that happened in the 2010s, the Institute for Cultural Evolution was formed. I just thought that's important to put in there because, everything we're doing today came out of that. So that was very important. And then, of course, COVID ends the decade. We get George Floyd and like this very strong ascendancy of the social justice movement and this very strong reaction to it. So culture wakes up to the social justice battles and it picks sides, right? So what does that mean about today? Well, I'm going to say the changing calculus of cultural evolution. First of all, you have new generations gaining power, and this is important. There was a great article in the day in the New York Times by Thomas Chatterton Williams, who's a very bright guy. He was talking about his students. And like his students were 4 years old when Obama got elected. I mean, you just forget, like, you know, you have a generations that are coming of age today that have a very different sense of history and are kind of schooled in a very different historical context than what you and I generally are aware of. Now, the beautiful thing about developmental ideas and integral philosophy is that we've been warning about the dangers of overt and over the top anti modernism for 2 decades. We were there to the party before anyone. You know, we understood this dynamic before literally almost anyone in culture. Maybe a few areas in culture understood a little pieces of it. But, you know, one of the great signs of truth is predictive power, right? That is one of the great signs of truth in modernism and science. And so we can say that we had a lot of predictive power because we didn't see exactly how it was all going to go down, but we saw these dynamics and we knew they were going to play out in some form. So we had that. I think the truth of developmental ideas is partially affirmed by the enormous predictive power that they had in understanding the culture war dynamics, not exactly how they would go down, but in understanding the dynamics that they would go down in some form like that. So this is a more subtle point. So one of the important insights that emerged from a developmental or integral perspective over the last couple decades is that it's really important, even for those of us who lived and breathed in progressive spirituality and postmodern culture and understood it from the inside out. And many of the people that we share this sea culture with came out of that world. That it's really important not to be overly anti-modern because the whole spiral of development depends on a healthy modernism. And so, you know, so two things became very important in that movement, or at least in, I think, a lot of people who really understood that movement. One is bolstering healthy forms of modernism, not just being reflexively anti-capitalist, reflexively anti-modern, reflexively in all these different ways that you can be anti-modern. But understanding that healthy modernism is absolutely critical to a successful development, to a successful spiral development. And not just bashing traditionalism, right? A lot of progressives just bash traditionalism. A lot of moderns bash traditionalism. And not so those two pillars were important. You know, like, oh, there's a role for traditional culture. It may not be we can appreciate it. We can recognize its strengths. And we need a healthy forms of modernism. So the new atheists, for example, they defended modernism, but they bashed everyone else. They bashed traditionalism, right? So that it wasn't a developmental move. It wasn't an integral move. Now, the other reason that we needed to defend modernism, and this is, again, this gets into a more subtle area, is progressive postmodernism was moving along. It was basically okay. It didn't really need defending. It had a lot of moral power in the culture, a lot of moral influence. It was continuing to influence modernism in all kinds of ways. It was deemed basically fine. So but the culture didn't see how powerful and intense the attack on modernism would come from the social justice warriors, right? And so part of what we would sometimes do is warn that anti-modernism is a bigger problem than most of the culture realizes, right? That was a big move if you had a deep integral perspective, right? Healthy modernism. We can't bash modernism. We have to protect it from not just traditionalism, not just religion, but from progressive postmodernism, right? In spiral dynamics terms, you have to protect orange from green, right? Okay, so that calculus has changed, right? Now the cult, now modernism doesn't need defending as much, right? Because the culture's woken up. Modernism has to be defended. Modernism is in a reactionary mode. It's defending itself from postmodernism every day. There are people. There's a whole industries out there defending modernism from postmodernism. That is it does not need that anymore, right? Now there are people in culture who any hint of postmodernism is evil. Any hint of progressive spirituality is just more of the same postmodernism, and that's evil. The culture is in a reactionary mode. Modernism is being defended. Now, I would argue, as integralists, as developmentalists, as people who are trying to care for the whole spiral and understand these dynamics of development, we have to also defend progressive postmodernism some. We have to remind the culture that there are healthy forms of it, that it's positive, that it's important, that it's good. I understand that sometimes integralists are afraid that everyone's just going to collapse into green. I get that. But we have to remind the culture that there are healthy forms of it and continue to feature and emphasize those healthy forms. For the first time in the history of civilization, I'll say, healthy green needs to be defended and bolstered. It didn't really need it before, but now it does. Okay, so some possible current seed cultures, in case you're wondering. So I just got back from MAPS, the psychedelic conference in Denver a few weeks ago. It's a perfect example of a very powerful seed culture, right? That's trying to push the idea of psychedelics for health and for mental health into the culture. It's very influential right now. And the dynamics have all the dynamics of seed cultures. And I was very struck by that. Metamodernism. Now, I don't know enough about metamodernism to say accurately if this is a seed culture or how dynamic it is or how influential it is. I put it up there because I think I think it is a form of seed culture. Whether or not it will be influential or whether or not be powerful and whether or not it's already faded is all an open question. I feel like someone else probably knows better than I do, but I thought it was worth mentioning. I know some people feel strongly about it. Now, this is a personal one. I'm interested in UFOs and the dynamics around it. I went to a conference recently on UFOs and non-human intelligence and some of the dynamics around that. I'm telling you, it was so similar to the psychedelic conference I went to MAPS. It was so similar. And it really struck me. The dynamics around this are very similar. You could see, and I saw, oh, this is a structure of a seed culture. It looks very similar. And the things they did were very similar. So it made me reflect a lot. And they're both pushing ideas into culture that are, I think, probably important. And those two seed cultures are about the only seed cultures right now, ironically enough, that have bipartisan support, that are not caught in culture war. And they both are funneling people from modernism into postmodernism. They're funneling people up the spiral, both of them, in a way that very few seed cultures are. Now, this is another one I don't know much about, so maybe someone does and they can illuminate this. But I thought it's interesting right now. Because in the tech modernist world, many of them have rejected the meaning making of progressive spirituality, and because they're suspicious of postmodernism, progressive postmodernism, many of them have gone back to forms of traditional. So they've gone back to Christ for meaning, to traditional culture for meaning, or at least some form of traditional culture. So there is this whole overlapping world right now between Christ, crypto, and tech that I'm not smart enough or aware enough to fully understand, but I think there might be a seed culture in there, and we'll see what kind of influence it ultimately has, good or bad, on the culture. I'm not saying all seed cultures are even positive. I don't know, but we'll see. Maybe it'll be positive. And the intellectual dark web that I watched. I kind of got a front row seat to that one. I wasn't part of it, but I knew a number of the people in it. And so I kind of got a front row seat and watched them just blow up with those ideas over about a 3 or 4 or 5 year period. It was fascinating to see that. Now, I think the intellectual dark web has faded now, but because it did its job and it's fundamentally, doesn't really have a job to, it had one job to do and it really did it. So. Okay, so we come back to the idea of a plateau. And I know I called it the title of that, and then when I did the whole talk, I didn't talk much about plateau. So I apologize. But it's still a very good idea. And this, unlike truces or seed cultures or 3 phases of postmodernism, this is definitely not my idea. This is George Leonard's idea, one of the founders of the human potential movement. I interviewed George he died in the mid 2000s. I interviewed him about 2001. And I remember in that interview, the idea that struck me the most was what he talked about developmental plateau. And I think he was talking about personal development, but I think I want to apply the same idea to cultural evolution. It doesn't map perfectly. It changes a little bit, but it's a really interesting idea. And I think it applies to our moment. So his idea was that one of the things we don't understand about development is we think when we develop as individuals, when we feel ourselves changing and evolving and going through this big transformation, we think that that's what we're doing. We're in that moment, we're going through a big transformation, we're developing and evolving. But his point was that's not necessarily true. What often happens is we might go through 10 years of work and practice and put in a lot of effort and a change and transformation, and we might not experience the results of that effort for years or for a long period of time. But then you go through these moments where all the effect of all that work you put in suddenly emerges, and for a few months you might feel like, oh, I'm changing, I'm developing, everything is better, everything is different. And that is true, and that's a beautiful thing. But the development, as he puts it, the development happens on the plateau. When you felt like you were on a plateau, you might feel for a long time like you're on the plateau. But if you keep working and putting in the effort and practice and concern and all of that, eventually you will experience the results of your efforts. But you make the mistake of thinking what you did in those moments is the transformational power, it's a transformational activity, but it's development happens on the plateau. Development happens on the plateau. You can lift weights and not get stronger for a while, and then suddenly you get a lot stronger. And you think that you're doing the right thing then, but development happens on the plateau. So that's a powerful way to think about it. And evolution happens on the plateau. So in culture, right now, we are in this era of reaction and retrenchment, right? This era of it makes it hard to move forward. The culture war dynamics make movement forward really difficult. It prevents certain types of evolution, right? Certain types of cultural development can't happen while you're in a culture war, an all-out culture war, while modernism is so retrenched and so reactionary, and all this stuff is happening, right? But I think it's good to understand that maybe the part of what we're doing now is that we're in a time of inclusion, not transcendence. We're reaching back, we're including more. The dynamics that have happened in culture are potentially paving the way for a whole different kind of transcendence that we will get to later. And the better we do this, the better that transcendence will be. So a little bit like, evolution happens on the plateau. In this case, evolution happens in the churn, in the difficulty, right? In trying to work out work out the relationships between these worldviews that are in such dynamic battles right now. We have to work those out. We have to figure those out. We have to reach down and include more people. Part of what we're doing, right? Include more worldviews. Include more elements of our shared culture that we weren't including before, right? And understanding what role they play and how to bring them into whatever the next integrative move is going to be, right? There will be an integrative move, but it won't be but it's not going to happen right now. It's not going to happen probably for some time. But that integrative move will be more powerful if we are able to do this part of it better. Ultimately, the action will be in forms of synthesis between modernism and postmodernism. Again, I think we should take some awareness of the fact that some of that original seed culture emerged out of consciousness movement. It emerged out of some truce between modern and postmodern. It emerged out of some early synthesis there. Of course, we have to honor traditionalism as well. So if I'm talking about what we can do, well, sometimes cultural evolution seems so big, it's hard to get your hands around. But positive seed cultures generate positive seed cultures. And you can't snap your fingers, but it's more doable. Positive seed cultures are important. That's how culture moves forward. We can do that, or we can look for that, or we can start to build those. That's where cultural evolution happens. And the last piece I just said is evolution will surprise. I mean, I always think of 1935. I mean, where culture and the economy and the world was at in 1935. I mean, you could not imagine 20 years could go by and you could be where you are in 1955. I mean, a lot happened. It's just culture can surprise. Again, we don't know the development that's happening that will allow a transcendence to burst forth, or an evolutionary movement to burst forth. We don't know when that one can be. We can't really know, right? It might be a lot sooner than any of us think. It might not be, but it will surprise. And I think we have to remember sometimes when things change in culture, even over the last decade, you see that they change with a speed that is shocking. In conclusion, a tense dynamic truce is fertile soil of synthesis in the garden of transcendence, helped along by creative seed cultures, providing the nascent developmental structures for tomorrow's bountiful cultural harvest. In the meantime, love the plateau.
All right. Carter, thank you so much. Man, I was not expecting that to be so motivational. That was great. So if you have a question, anything that this talk stirred up for you, please raise your hand using the raise hand button, and I will call on you. All right, let's start off with Michael and then David.
Okay, great. Thanks. I'm having some technical difficulties. Can you hear me?
A little bit. It's starting to break up, but I'll interrupt you if it does fully break up.
Okay, I'm going to go off video, see if it's better. So Carter, thanks for your passion. I love you inspire me. And I'm wondering, what I see in the political realm, like what Musk is just now trotting out, the 80% in the middle of starting a third party.
Yeah.
And he has the potential to just reframe the entire political process. And I think this could definitely be a senius, expansive senius movement, depending on how he handles it, because he's going to have a lot of say in it and what the platform is, but he's brought in Yang. And I just see that as kind of potentially transformational.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering how that lands for you. And go ahead, rip me apart if I'm wrong.
Well, I'll say it like this. I don't know if that will be transformational or not, but I think things like that eventually will be transformational. Whether it's this or that thing, I think we are in we're in a moment where a lot Musk is interesting, right? Because he was someone who was influenced by the IDWC culture, right? That made a huge influence on him, right? That, as it did with a lot of Silicon Valley, right? That it moved and changed some of Silicon Valley. Now, I don't know enough about whether or not he'll be able to do what he's going to do and what influence it will have. Yeah, of course I don't. But what I think is like it's the fact that he's doing that and he's got a lot of power and a lot of influence. I don't know what ultimately it will have, but I think things like that, sooner or later, something like that is going to succeed, is going to have a big influence. So I just think it's a sign of the times that he's trying to do that and feels he can. Whether, I don't know, is a new party, is that going to be the way that the whole political system starts to break up and change and mix? Maybe. I don't, I'm not smart enough to know. But I think we're in an era where things like that have a much more of a chance of having a cultural impact than they ever would have before. And so whether or not it will be him, whether or not it will be someone else, it's really interesting. Because I think what needs to happen is people are going to have to take in the way that Trump did, honestly. Trump took a very unpredictable mix, right? His mix, his coalition was very unpredictable, right? No one predicted that coalition, right? And I think you're going to have to see that in more ways in the next years. People are going to have to have success by taking unpredictable coalitions with new types of synthesis. And I think that's what's going to be powerful, and that will have the potential to be powerful. They will surprise in various ways,
Yeah. Just from a developmental perspective, it's kind of like if he could get, he has the potential to peel out the deeply reactive phase of the right and say, hey, come on, we want to get over here, and bring over the left people and say, come on, we have more in common than we don't.
His movement is a sign that we may be passing through the most reactive phase of that movement, right? We may be in we may have hit peak retrenchment, peak reactivity, and now the culture is trying to figure out what's new, and that's interesting, right?
Yeah. Thank you.
All right, let's do David, Elaine, and then Ellen.
Hey, Carter, great presentation. Definitely appreciated the way you wove some of these concepts together. I love the seed cultures phrase coinage. And ending there with the fertile. Exactly. Get that off to the presses. And with the finishing point of the fertile soil, following that, today's fertile soil was yesterday's manure. I would say, given the amount of manure we're collectively sitting in, there's a lot of fertile soil on deck for tomorrow. Where I'm curious to hear more of your thoughts on, if you look at the emergence of modernism from traditionalism, modernism was its whole new thing. It wasn't post-traditionalism. It wasn't necessarily critique of traditionalism. It was the emergent, following your seed metaphor, an emergent fruit that came off an unknowable fruit that came off the vine. So the way you kind of initially broke out the social justice, environmentalism, and consciousness movements, social justice from one angle is critique that modernism hasn't gone far enough. What about equal rights for all these people? The environmentalism is it's gone too far. Look, we can't drink the water, we can't eat the food, we can't breathe the air. What's going on here? And the consciousness, it hasn't actually preserved the individual. That's the heart of modernism, the sovereign individual. So how would you see this emergent fruit? What's your intuition of the quantum leap that redefines our understanding of ourselves, that the postmodernism or the actual new thing doesn't have post in front of it is going to entail? What's your intuition on that? Because I think you're really in some rich, intuitively generative space here.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Could you say what you're asking? I appreciate everything you just said, but could you say what you're asking? I'm not sure if I'm.
I want to hear more about your intuition of what this fruit is that is the emergent that we can't see.
Yeah.
Because I feel you're closer to it than we are, and the way you've intuited seed culture, some of the other things. I feel like you haven't maybe given us every little bit of what you think is happening here.
Well, it's very interesting because, one of the challenges of, like, let's just use the term integral or developmental, either way, we can use either one. But one of the challenges as it emerged, there's a few things that are happening. One is, I think, because progressive postmodernism is so corrective in some ways, right? It's even more than modernism. It's a bit more corrective. I think, part of what needs to happen in integral or developmental, it needs to have some of modernism's spirit of forward movement, right? It's got to have some of that. It's got to have some, like, let's move, let's build, let's emerge, let's evolve, a lot of that. But it's different in the sense that, it's both its own stage, but it's also reaching back and appreciating and trying to sort of re-energize all the healthy aspects of the spiral, right? That's part of what it's doing. And I think that, one of my part of the challenge, I talked, so this is a thought, I don't know if I'm answering your question. When each worldview emerges, it emerges in dialectic with what comes before, right? So part of the challenge of any worldview is it, has to push off, right? And so I just told you in there, we need to also defend green. We need to defend postmodernism, right? Well, that may be hard for integralists who are trying to push off, right? Because a huge challenge is just to not everything collapse, is not have all integral movements, developmental movements collapse into green, right? That's a huge challenge in and of itself, right? You can see what John Mackey went through with conscious capitalism, trying to keep that movement from just becoming totally progressive postmodern, and then it loses its heart, right? So that's a real problem. At the same time, part of the challenge, I think, as integralist and developmentalist, and I haven't resolved all this myself, is that we have to also be in dialectic with the whole spiral, because integral is aware of the whole spiral in a way that no other worldview is. So we have to be in dialectic with the whole spiral, with every unhealthy version of it. And I think that's kind of how we get out of that, because it's like that there has to be some mix of dialectic and affirmation, right? Dialectic with all the unhealthy aspects and affirmation of the healthy aspects. And it's a tricky one. I don't know. It's hard. But I do feel that even with recent cultural events, that becomes more important, right? We can't just react. We can't just be overly reactive, or we'll just collapse back into modernism, So anyway, all of those are really good questions, and all of the I think, and I talked about this in my last talk here. The other thing I'll say to your question, and I feel like I'm not probably answering it very deeply. I feel it's instructive that to the extent that we had some emergence of developmental culture and integral culture, it came out of the consciousness movement. I think maybe that won't happen again. Maybe it'll be different. But I feel like there's something about passing through some elements of that movement that is important for a future, for what we're looking for in the emergence of developmental, of integral, because there's something about understanding consciousness. And again, now I'm getting back into the last talk I gave, so I won't go too far on this. There's something about understanding consciousness, not just as an individual thing, but as a collective thing, that you need those dimensions to come online to fully appreciate the spiral development in all the ways you need to understand the developmental dynamics. It's very hard to appreciate that like on a flat plane. You need the depth of consciousness to kind of appreciate that. And there's something about going through the consciousness movement that makes you start to appreciate that there's a lot more going on here than I realized. It's also why, I'll add, that the psychedelic movement and the UFO movement I talked about, because they're bringing people through that doorway. That's the doorway into progressivism, is the consciousness piece. And that's why I think they're both kind of interesting in the culture right now. So anyway.
Cool.
So you're saying that it's aliens.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not saying it's aliens, but it's aliens.
Thanks, man.
All right, we're going to go to Elaine and then Ellen. And then for those of you who have your hands raised but don't have your camera on, please turn your camera on and then I'll call on you. All right, Elaine, go for it.
Thank you. It was great to hear you, and I love your idea of seed cultures. And I was wondering
It's good.
whether we could consider the refocus on the indigenous wisdom, what they bring to us as a very different worldview from what we Westerners have adopted since the Enlightenment.
Yes.
And the focus on local, there is a group called Local Futures, and focusing on solutions that would be more local, but and actually away from generalizations that we have loved as Westerners. So, and for me, that's probably the most distance we can take from the current worldview is go in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
Is it included in your perspective? Is that another possible seed culture that could come in as well? Because it's actually pre-traditional.
Yeah, I think that, thank you. Al, nice to see you, by the way. It's been a long time. Yeah, I didn't talk about, indigenous cultures, and that's obviously a huge part of the picture in a couple interesting ways. One, but yes, I think there's important wisdom there that postmodernism is reclaiming. I think it's doing a good job of that. It is now it goes over the top and it romanticizes and all that, sure, but it's also like we should just encourage that, except it is doing the work of reclaiming that, and that is really good. And there's some elements in that reclamation that are really important to bring forward, and I'm going to mention two of them, which is that one that was one of the last, that was like that culture in a way that is only partially true in traditionalism and is not true in modernism, that has a kind of awareness of intersubjective consciousness, right? And so that look in its own form in an earlier era, et cetera, but it was still there, right?
It was.
And bringing that forward is something that is absolutely critical. So to the extent that we can bring forward some of the wisdom that acculturated around that notion, that will be really important. And that, because we need all that we can get, because we're re-embracing that idea and we're new to it. We don't understand it, right? So that is really important. So and postmodernism is doing that work, and we should encourage it and welcome it, in that way. Obviously there's versions of it that are over the top and not good. But the other piece I'll say is it's the last. This is probably going further out there than this group may accept, but it's the last culture that really more fully accepted forms of non-human intelligence.
Yes.
And that was that indigenous world. They had, and in their own way, in little ways here and there. I'm not saying it was a huge part, but it was more part of their culture. And that combines with that recognition of the intersubjective dimensional nature of consciousness. And so that's another way in which we're going to we don't have a lot of ways as a culture to understand this. And we're going to inevitably have to reach back to some of those ways, even as we interpret them and transcend and include for our own time. But those are two ways in which I think they're going to be absolutely critical.
Yeah. And as Otto Scharmer says, it does address two of the divides, the spiritual divide, as well as the separation from nature.
Right, and the nature is another really important one.
It's
exactly.
Still prevalent even in postmodernism. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, let's go to Ellen and then Stephen Greenleaf.
Okay, hi, thank you. This metaphor of seeds brings me to a question that I keep struggling with. And then after I wrote the question, I kind of had an answer that led to another question. So my question is, how can we create a centralized, uncentralized meeting space for the seeds to become a garden together? And then I thought, oh, wait a minute. It's like people like me who are bees. I go everywhere. I'm in this group, I'm
There
in
you
that
go.
group.
Right.
But the question then becomes, where do I go with the pollen? So
Good question. I don't have an answer to that, but I like the bee metaphor. That's good. And I think one of the things about seed cultures that I like beyond just like the idea of genius or a culture of genius or culture of exciting ideas that gets birthed is you need lots of different elements to that culture. I had that unique chance to be one of the forums in which a seed culture was represented, right? The magazine, was Enlightenment, but it doesn't have to be. It could be, and magazines have often been forums for seed cultures. But it can be a conference. It can be podcast. The intellectual dark web got propagated through podcast, and a few podcasts lit up because of it, right? That was kind of how it got propagated. So it can be different forms, but you need community organizers, and you need conferences, and you need people who are good at forums. You need all these different roles that create an effective seed culture, and not just thinkers or not just the artist. You need different things, and you need people. You need bees, right? Good, I like it.
Yeah. And it doesn't have to be huge. It starts with
No,
2 or more people.
people never understood. Like I remember like our magazine never reached that many people, but I remember like Deepak Chopra was a reader and Ray Kurzweil was a reader, and they both loved it. They both said it was their favorite magazine. So it just is a reminder, cultural influence does not have to be, it can be very powerful and even broad, but it's like, I don't know the word, it's immediate. Yeah, it can be very concentrated too. It can be very concentrated, and those ideas can have a big impact. So it's a good lesson in that it doesn't have to be a massive movement.
Yeah. All right, Stephen, and then Barbara.
Thanks. I enjoyed your talk, Carter. And
Thanks,
by the
Stephen.
way, former Enlightenment Now reader too. I don't want to rain on the parade, but have you theorized?
Bring it on.
Have you theorized what I'll term devolution? In other words, the potential that a thesis and an antithesis can, instead of leading to a synthesis, a fruitful synthesis, lead to chaos.
Yeah.
And what my concern is, I look at the politics in the US today and the situation with our legal system and the way things are going generally. I see a devolution. I see a loss of rights, a loss of protections, a breakdown of many systems, including, for instance, respect for science, that in my previous 60 years or so, I thought impregnable.
Yeah.
And now things seem to be going backwards. So how do we deal with this? How do we balance the possibilities here? And because I want to see the progress. I've seen progress,
Yeah.
cultural development, but I also see what I now think of more and more as out and out regression.
Yeah. So, I mean, you saw my positive hat tonight. I think I just naturally get a little more positive when I speak about these things. I think in other moments I'm not near as positive, and I think that's just part of the reality. But I appreciate that. And I think that there's no guarantees to this process, other than maybe in the long, long run. Maybe there's a guarantee.
In the long run, we're all dead, right?
Exactly, right. What I mean is that when you go through any period, there are certain dangers. And we're in a period now, that period of regression and retrenchment and culture war battles that can turn into real wars, and when you go through times like that, there's always the chance that so much breakdown happens that the breakdown becomes the challenge itself, right? That so much breaks down, it takes a much longer time to reform and to reemerge And that's a danger. I think it's a danger of these moments, and it's a danger of like of the way we approach these ideas in a somewhat unconscious manner. Because when the idea of conscious evolution has been used for all kinds of things. But for me, what it means as much as anything is that when you evolve unconsciously, you are much more likely to just evolve reactively, right? Meaning you're going to just, and as we are more global society, and as we have more and more massive amounts of technology, and as we are capable of, of weapons of mass destruction in various forms, even maybe cultural weapons of mass destruction, if I can use that term. You need to be able to evolve more consciously. Like I said, you need that hammer is dangerous. Sometimes it's needed, maybe, but it's dangerous. And you can't just pretend it's not. It is dangerous. And sometimes you break things you don't mean to break. And right now we're in the period of breaking a lot of stuff, right? Now, that may allow new and better forms to emerge that will ultimately we'll be able to look back and recognize that process was important. You hope for that, but you're in the process of breaking. And when you break shit, sometimes things just break down and things can go wrong, and you can spiral off into all kinds of directions. So yes, I mean, there are significant dangers to going through a period like this.
There's creative destruction, and then there's just destructive destruction, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And sometimes it's hard to tell the difference.
Yeah.
Until later.
Yeah.
So absolutely.
Okay. Thanks very much.
All right, Barbara.
Thanks for this, Carter. I always enjoy listening to you. I've been reading Pluckrose's cynical theories and Mustafa Al-Garba's We Were Never Woke. And I am becoming 1,000% convinced that postmodernism is not congruent with healthy green. It never was. And Pluckrose, when she talks about cynical theories and all of that ultra woke crap that's turned the left so totalitarian, it's become a problem. So maybe what I'm wondering is if we need to be careful with our thinking. Maybe postmodernism is the wrong word for that. And what we want is healthy green. And instead we're using postmodern as a not very good placeholder for it. Your thoughts on that, Carter?
Fair enough. Postmodernism is the word often identified with the academic side of green, and then now it's become identified with the unhealthy sides of the academic side of green. And now, so sometimes I just throw a bunch of words out because I don't know what quite words to use. So it's a fair concern, and it's a fair criticism. And yeah, there are versions of green or of postmodernism out there that have few redeeming qualities,
like
and sometimes it's also the progressive worldview being adopted by individuals who are developmentally at a different place, and then applying them like an absolute, applying them like they're in some socialized consciousness, to use Keegan's term. They're applying that idea. Anytime a worldview emerges, it can be sort of used and applied by people at all different stages of individual development. And sometimes you see that in that movement, So the other thing I'll say is that their cynical theories is on my desk over here with Pluckrose, and I enjoy Pluckrose. But I find James Lindsay really interesting because I follow him on Twitter, and he's a perfect example, right, of someone who's defending modernism to the death. Now he's defending it against the woke right. That's what he's defending. Right now online, he's in constant battles with the woke right, which is like for us a version of traditionalism, defending modernism. And before he was defending it against the woke left, right? But so that is what it is, and that's fine. But he's fascinating because he's someone who he's very culturally intelligent in the sense that he can recognize like any part of the progressive worldview, any hint of it. I saw someone share something. Steve and I were part of this group called the Evolutionary Leaders at one point, which is like a bunch of spiritual teachers and new age leaders and stuff. And, you know, like a decade ago or a long time ago. And someone on Twitter was sharing something from the Evolutionary Leaders and saying, this is horrible. And then he was sharing it and saying it was like this evil thing, you know, all these horrible communists who were just out to destroy everything, you know. And it's just, but again, you see people who are very culturally intelligent but have no developmental perspective. And he's one of those people. He's like, he can recognize any hint of green and he right away he's on it. But he doesn't understand, you know, that it's not the same as the other side. You know, it's like,
yeah, healthy green would be really nice. It would, but I think then we don't recognize it because it gets tied up in all this other crap.
yeah,
You know, your point about I'd say the integralists, we need to be so careful about when we throw small m memes out there and start, you know, saying things, to think about how a traditional mind picks that up, and often it's pathetically bad. And
yeah,
I think that what I've seen in our local college students sometimes, from both modernists and postmodernists in the schools, is that, you know, we've got 20-year-old students whose prefrontal cortex hasn't developed yet, and they're picking this stuff up as the gospel according to Professor X. And, you know, it's damaging their brains.
yeah,
What they should be doing is developing a healthy orange skepticism. And instead, they're just getting indoctrinated in the
sure.
because I said so that comes down from modern and postmodern.
Exactly. And then they're being kind of forced to choose sides way too early in their lives, you know, because you know what you think for a while. You have to try things on.
Yeah,
All
you have
right.
to learn.
Okay, we are out of time, y'all. This was fantastic. I feel like we could just, as usual, keep discussing this, but we'll just have to continue on YouTube when we post this talk. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Carter. That was
Thanks,
fantastic.
Carter.
Thank you. I appreciate it, guys. Sorry, Michael, we didn't get to you.
One last little announcement. Next month's meeting is on Wednesday, August 13th. Our presenter will be John Street. So looking forward to that. And I will see you all next month.
Thanks, Virgil. Thanks, everybody.
All right. See y'all.
Thanks, Bye.